We are live. Hello, everybody. We are live. Welcome. We are live. We are here to honor the power and the life of George Floyd. We're going to give a couple of minutes and seconds for folks to come in. Put in the chat where you are joining from. And I just want to see who's in community. Morning, Coach, or afternoon for me. Afternoon, Coach. Thanks for joining. If you want to put in the chat where you're coming from, I'm Dr. Ashley Gaddy Robbins. I am in Clayton, North Carolina. And so I am coming to you from the South. And I'm super excited to be in community. My research and my work is around resisting 2020. And a major part of 2020 was the unfortunate murder of George Floyd. And while I talk about the impacts of the murder of George Floyd, the beauty of my research is that I talk about everyday resistance strategies and the ways in which we can resist and persist past systems of oppression and systems of power. And so I am here today to not only honor the life of George Floyd, but to also share with you some ways in which the things we already do are seen as forms of everyday resistance. And we can continue to press on and we can continue to resist against systems of power and oppression. And so it's a lot of things, multiple things that we are doing. And the ways in which I have decided to do that today to honor George Floyd is to read from my research. And so this will be a live reading of my work. And the name of my work is Resisting 2020, Resisting Through 2020. Political strategies of Black women receiving government assistance in the United States during Floyd, COVID-19, and the Trump administration. So my work, my research focuses on 2020 and the ways in which we resist that. So come on in. Hi, Mom 21. Welcome. Come on in to this space. You don't have that. You can put this on in the background. You don't have to be fully engaged, but I just wanted to just create time and space to not only honor George Floyd, but to also showcase the ways in which we resist every day against these systems. It's been 5 years. So although we were brought to national consciousness about George Floyd on a very global consciousness on May 30th of 2020, George Floyd was murdered on May 25th of 2020. And so in light of it being 5 years since his murder, and I'm being very specific with my terms, he did not pass away. He did not die. George Floyd was perfectly fine and was murdered on May 25th, 2020. And so it is very important for me on almost 5 years to the day in which he was murdered to really just pause and recognize him. And doing this with a live audience and doing this in community with so many people is the ways in which I just try to really honor him. So thank you so much for joining. Continue to put in the chat where you are joining us from. Even if you're watching this after the fact, put in the chat. I would love to see where you all are connecting from. So this is what I'm going to do. I have 3 sections of my work that I am going to read from. The first section is just going to be an introduction. And then the main reason why we are here, I'm going to read the Racial Reckoning chapter. And then I'm also going to end with reading a piece of the end, which is the community support strategy. Because again, it is not just enough to talk about the ways in which oppression impacts us. We also need to be talking about the ways in which we resist these. And the thing is that folks think that resisting is this major thing. It has to be this huge protest. It has to be this big megaphone. My work has coined the term everyday resistance strategies. It's the things that we're already doing in our everyday life that actually also count as forms of resistance and political strategies. So that's just the path and the journey that we're going on. Again, you can come in and you can come out. You can just have this as your background noise, but I'm going to start reading from my work on resisting through 2020. And I am going to start with the introduction. If you are just joining, I'm Dr. Ashley Gaddy Robbins, she, her pronouns. I am a speaker and a scholar and a consultant of all the things. And I do the work of centering humanity in our everyday practices, in our everyday life. And this, my research is a large part of what grounds me in the academy, but also in my practitioner work. So I'm also a full-time entrepreneur. So if you are watching this, you're like, oh my gosh, we need her to come speak. We need her to kind of do a podcast. We need her to do a news segment. Hit your girl up. Okay, send me a DM, send me an email. My information is on YouTube, on TikTok. Hi, my Black is beautiful. Thanks for joining. I'm also on TikTok Live and YouTube Live. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to start with my introduction. If you have questions, if you have comments, please use the chat. We are in community today. We are all honoring the power and the life of not only George Floyd, but of Black people, of people in general. Like, I'm just so grateful to be in community. So use the chat. Here's the introduction. Quote, while it's personal despiting to see your work targeted in bad faith, what's more distressing to me is that the lives of women of color I've written about are being diminished and erased in a political moment in which we need the stories most, end quote. That is a quote by Kimberly Crenshaw in 2023. The year 2020 in the United States will more than likely find its way in the textbooks for children to learn about in school. Edits and revisions have already occurred in scholarly publications to include the historic events that shaped the lives of so many. On February 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization announced an official name for the disease causing the 2019 novel outbreak, coronavirus, or COVID-19. On May 30th, 2020, the conversation about systemic racism extended beyond COVID as the world watched the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man killed by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota, all while Donald Trump was president. And while more national and global headlines circulated that year, these three events are what Time magazine mentioned will go down in history books. And what factors guide the research for this project? Numerous groups of people, no matter their identity, were impacted by these three factors. However, this project is interested in how they specifically impacted Black women receiving government assistance in the United States. More specifically, this project focuses on the ways that these factors, Trump and his administration, COVID-19, and racial tension post the murder of George Floyd, or what we have known as scholars as the summer of racial reckoning, impacted how women thought about their bodies, reproduction, and motherhood. And I just want to pause here to say that I wrote this and started this in 2020. It is 2025 and there are already so many overlaps. Welcome, Jacqueline. There's already so many overlaps to the work of 2020 and 2025. Like sometimes, in some ways, I feel like my research is more needed for these times in 2020 than they were 2025 than they were 2020. So it's just showcase. It just goes to show you how we cycle through the same things. Trump was ending his presidency when I wrote this the first time, and he's back again. So these things really cycle. Historically, Black women receiving government assistance in the U.S. have been negatively impacted by institutions of power and political events such as presidential elections and welfare reform. And 2020 does not yield a different outcome. Instead of focusing the research questions solely to these negative effects, they are arranged to spotlight the political strategies used by these women to resist and to cope and navigate around these systemic oppressions that these factors have on their bodies. Hi, Crystal, welcome. When Black women's politics is situated within the idea of structural intersectionality, the numerous ways Black women resist the negative impacts that come from it are recognized, which is the focus of this project. Using Black feminist intersectional methodology, this qualitative project not only centers Black women who receive government assistance by using their narratives as the primary form of research. Hi, Donna. I just want to recognize that your lived experience is quality, primary, credible research. See, power tries to tell us that you have to have a PhD, or you have to have amount of years of experience, or that your lived experience doesn't matter. No. Your lived experience matters, and it is credible. Quite honestly, true knowledge and power is situated in lived experience. That's why they want to make credibility something else. Because if I say that a college degree is how one is smart, then that erases a lot of people for being seen as credible, because they know not everybody does or can get a college degree. And so these things are very strategic. Power is very strategic in the ways in which it tries to regulate us, right? And education is one of those things. That's why it was so important to me for me to be able to use these ladies' real life, real world experience as the primary research. It also suggests that they are not disposable, and it centers their resistance and social transformation. And I'm reading from my research. If you are interested in buying this, you can absolutely do so. Again, send me a DM or email, and I'll be happy to send you the link. All right, sorry, I lost my spot. This perspective contributes to scholarship that negates a more traditional narrative about Black women who are economically disadvantaged in academic writing, which will be examined later. See, they like to position us as bad mothers, welfare queens, for example, but this project goes beyond describing the individual experiences of these women, but seeks to reveal how their identities are produced, forged, and deployed to disrupt oppressive vehicles of power. This paradigm requires examining how each factor is produced, when and how people make use of the particular identities of the subject, in this case, Blackness, woman, and economically disadvantaged. It's important to understand the intersections in which these women stand in. These women are Black. These women are, they're Black, they're women, right? And in this case, they're at the intersections of receiving government assistance. But even if you don't identify in all of those identities, this work still applies because you can understand the importance of intersections. Maybe you're a Black, but you may not be a woman. Maybe you're a woman, but you may not be Black. Maybe you are on government assistance. Maybe you're not. Either way, this work is so meaningful, but it was so imperative for me to talk about race, class, and gender, because these three identities are usually the ones that create inequities and are most talked about. It also requires identifying and analyzing how they are impacted by these factors on multiple levels, including the local level of their bodies, their families, and their communities, but also the national and global level. Using the narratives of the interviewed women as the primary method of research in this way, it is practicing resistance against whitewashed patriarchal scholarship and culture that paints distorted images of the very women who have allowed society to function. What drives this intent to center Black women's resistance is the work of McKittick and Tracy Walters, and their work on resistance of Black domestic workers and rebellious methodological work. Sorry. Kiddick is intentional about the way she structures the stories in her book, Dear Science and Other Stories, to push against traditional ideas of how knowledge is produced, showing how Black creatives and scholars attend to science in their work. McKittick structures her thoughts in a series of stories that center Black life and Black experiences as a way to hold on to the rebellious work of sharing ideas in an unkind world. The stories shared by McKittick, like the ones that will be shared in this project, are connected through knowledge systems, Black liveliness, and liberatory ways of knowing. This process of placing Black women's narratives at the core, they are, they enhance the power that is embedded in their knowledge. The act of centering their stories is an act of resistance within itself. In Not Your Mother's Mammy, Walters centers the book on three core themes: representation, resistance, and performance. Understanding how intersectional oppression denies Black women's opportunities to control their own stories, her work looks at the ways former domestic workers restructure their image and narrative in Black media. What this project looks to replicate and extend is Walter's process of featuring Black women, and in this case, Black women who receive government assistance. In the US, engaged in performative acts of resistance that enable them to establish their identities as multidimensional, because we are not one way, we are not one thing, and also with a deep understanding of the world far beyond class. This dissertation or this research brings visibility to the powerful stories of resistance of Black economically disadvantaged women, often neglected in academic studies and national corporate media. This research is structured to display the findings from interviews along with supplying scholarship throughout each chapter. So that is the introduction. Now I'm going to read the racial reckoning chapter. This really allows us to get an understanding not just of the murder of George Floyd and the racism that surrounded it, but also understanding that, unfortunately, George Floyd is not the first person that has died because of brutality. Heightened race relations is something that has gone on over and over, time and time again. Even now, if I look at the comments on my TikTok live, there's negative comments now about my hair, about my identity. It is so prevalent. And so it is so important for us to understand and keep saying people's names and keep honoring their power and keep honoring their stories. And so I talked to 11 Black women who received government assistance in the US over a span of a year. And while I'm going to talk about George Floyd and race relations, I'm also going to speak to some of these women's strategies. And then again, like I said, I am going to end with community support because it's so important. So here's chapter 3. It's called Heightened Race Relations. It starts like this, quote, "And while Floyd was down on the ground, advocating for himself, expressing his unbearable pain in his final moments of life, this 46-year-old Black man cries out for his mother, who, though she undoubtedly did the best she could not protect him or save him from a broken system. Fear is a mental home base for mothers of Black sons, end quote. On May 30th, 2020, the conversation about systemic racism extended beyond COVID-19 as the world watched the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Journalists and scholars analyzed why this murder was different from the others and how the impact may spark change in the United States. After suspecting that Floyd was using a counterfeit $20 bill to purchase cigarettes, 3 squad cars arrived to confront Floyd, resulting in the police officer Derek Chauvin, quote, casually kneeling on the victim's neck, end quote, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and ultimately Floyd's death. Following the murders of Breonna Taylor in March of 2020 and Ahmaud Arbery in February of 2020, Floyd's vicious murder spurred an international uprising of protest and riots and triggered civic unrest in the United States at a scale we had not seen since the Civil Rights Movement, also known as the Summer of Racial Reckoning. The women in this study spoke to how this and other heightened race tensions after the killings of Black men and women by police officers affected the ways they see themselves and think of motherhood. Unlike Trump and COVID-19, racial reckoning has a long history for Black women who have been economically disadvantaged in the U.S. It has a long history on their bodies, on their reproduction, and on motherhood. This chapter provides a brief historical review of the ways they were impacted by the institution of racism before exploring the impacts brought upon by the Summer of Racial Reckoning. So I'm just going to give a very high overview of what that long history has been. Now, could I go into chattel slavery? Yes, I could. And trust me, there are very valid reasons to. But for my purposes of this research, I started at emancipation. Historical racial impacts. The emancipation of enslaved Black Americans documented to have been June 19th, 1865, what we know, Juneteenth. Ushered in the Reconstruction period. Black Americans were eager to receive the promises of equality stated in the Constitution. Black women were now expected to receive money for their own families in exchange for their labor. One of the ways Black women began to take charge is making this promise a reality, was to form clubs that centered the fight against inequities and inequality. Starting in the 1890s, the Black Women's Club movement was spurred by the efforts to end lynching. Ida B. Wells, if you don't know Ida, get to know Ida. Ida B. Wells traveled the country lecturing about lynching and founded Black women's clubs such as the Alpha Suffrage Club and co-founded the National Association of Colored Women, one of the largest coalitions for Black women assembled during these times, with local chapters all around the country. These women believed public health was particularly important in Black communities due to a shortage of healthcare professionals and medical institutions willing to serve the Black community. Again, we still see overlaps today. Smith explains how Black women's club movement saw itself as the pillar of healthcare work, saying, quote, Black club women believed that health work was distinctly women's work because of their unquestioned acceptance of the gendered division of labor of the family, their commitment to racial uplift and alleviating poverty, and their concerns about sexual mortality, end quote. It is important to note The position class, there's again, we're looking at race, class, and gender. It is important to note the position class played in the stance of sexuality for club women at this time. Black middle class women felt they had a personal stake in the improvement of the poor because of the potential effects of their own status. Again, racism and classism is so large that even the people who are oppressed by it also perpetuate it, right? So even though Black women were together in the Reconstruction time, this class status was a kind of turning tension point at times. It said that Black middle class women said, well, we need to improve the women who are, may not have as much status because it's going to affect our status. So we also just have to name some of these very real things that were happening even within Blackness, right? Because of racism, etc. These women constantly expressed their attitude about how the fate of their status was tied to economically disadvantaged communities, despite their efforts to distinguish themselves from the poor. To counter the racial, sexual stereotypes that attempted to depict Black women as promiscuous by nature, which primarily began during slavery, again, a stereotype made by people who are not even Black, club women felt compelled to expose that these are sexual myths and bring publicity to the sexual abuse that Black women were experiencing. A major goal of the National Association of Colored Women was to address sexual vulnerability by countering these negative sexual stereotypes with positive moral images of Black women's sexuality. During the early 20th century, the denial of government support activated Black women to respond to these inequities. In the early 1930s, while the country was in the Great Depression, talks of government aid began to spread. In response to this, the Social Security Act of 1935 was created as a part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program. The 18 million Americans affected by the Great Depression mostly consisted of, quote, elderly, disabled, and single mothers with children who already lived at a bare substantial level, end quote. The Social Security Act established programs that assisted each demographic, including a Social Security program funded by payroll taxes to contribute to the decline of poverty among the elderly and the unemployed. There was an insurance program by the state that assisted widows, poor children, the elderly poor, and the disabled. And there was an Aid for Dependent Children program, which provided aid to single mother homes. But when the act passed, agricultural workers and domestic servants, mostly Black men and women during this time, were excluded from these programs. And so spouses and children of ineligible workers were prohibited from receiving these benefits as well. These exclusions of rights for Black people, specifically Black women, charged a movement spearheaded by Black women to demand equality. The exclusion of Black women, even from monumental government assistance programs, continued into the civil rights era. And oftentimes, this is part of history that we may not know, right? We saw the civil rights movement and the March on Washington and so many people there, but in reality, there is still a gender divide. So during Reconstruction, we talked about a class divide. During the civil rights era, there is a gender tension, even within the Black community. And so we have to tell the full story so that we can really understand just where Black women have been positioned over time. So now we are in the 1950s, the 1960s. The executive order 10925, while that executive order implemented affirmative action to ensure the applicants were employed and that employees were treated fairly during unemployment without regard to race, creed, or color, it allowed Black men to enter jobs with higher wages. Black women were still not granted this same opportunity. Black women had to rely primarily on domestic work for income to provide for their families. The stability of the family was at stake and required Black women to work to uphold it. The stability, individually and collectively, Black women struggled to assert their right as dignified individuals having meaningful existence. They were seen as victims of their own ignorance. And many whites believe that they came from Black communities plagued with crime and poverty and elevated higher levels of premature pregnancies. So this depiction, this idea of Black life in white people's minds was common, and it helped to inform legal racial segregation policies. See, this is how power works, right? If the majority of people get to call you a thing or say that you're one thing, that message or that idea or that stereotype starts to spread. And then when it starts to spread, people start to believe it. And when they believe it, they have the power to then create laws around it. This is how it all functions. So the image of Black women was uneducated domestics who forged during this time, and it echoed past ideas and images of the slavery era and rearticulated them in the context of the 20th century civil rights movement. However, scholars like Tracy Waters, in her book, Not Your Mother's Mammy, highlighted the ways in which Black women were resisting these images, disassociating with domestic work. Due to the activist work in the 1940s and 1950s by Black feminists like Claudia Jones and Dorothy Bolden, again, names that are usually not said often, but they are so powerful in the movement, who wrote extensively about the inequities of domestic workers and found organizations like the National Domestic Workers Union of America. Hundreds of domestic workers courageously helped bring visibility to the oppression of Black citizens by the white supremacists, showing once again this bottom-up approach of how Black women engaged in politics, revealing injustice on a national level. By the 1960s and 1970s, greater access to higher education, increasing opportunities in the private sector, and a rejection of labor that had a remnants to the plantation also led Black women to disassociate with domestic work. Black women were still spearheading the fight for public health initiatives, and by the 1960s, the battle for access to proper health care was intersecting with welfare right campaigns driven by the concept of motherhood. The family served as the fundamental social unit in the United States at this time. The family structure was shaped by middle-class suburbia, which created the notion that the family unit was uniform throughout all sectors. Again, the white picket fence, the family of four, the house the mom who's a housewife. This is what they said stability was. This is what they said the family unit was. This idea of the normal family, meaning the idea of a family that was accepted as good and right and safe, is one that, quote, the white family has achieved at a high degree of stability and is maintaining stability. But in contrast, the family structure of lower class Negroes is highly unstable, end quote. And this is why this is written by Moynihan, which we know wrote the Moynihan Report. Due to the normal family standards set by white Americans, the unstable identity of the Black family became contingent upon the stable identity of the white family. Much like the perception of Black women's impure identity, it was made possible by the pre-established idea of white women's purity that developed during the time of slavery as well. Again, if a group is unpure, that means there has to be a group that is pure. So white women were seen as good and pure, which made Black women be seen as promiscuous and unstable. The constant exclusion of Black women and their role in the family making transcends through centuries. The release of the Mordahan Report in 1965 brought national attention to the implied instability in Black homes, showcasing high rates of families led by women and births out of wedlock. Conservatives used the results of the Mordahan Report to implement how Blacks should progress. Moral revitalization was the answer to progression, not economic or social support. So instead of supporting these communities, what did they want to do? They wanted to do a reform to make sure that morality, good morals was in place. To uphold this image of America as a civil society, stable families needed to be at the forefront. So the report results argued that Black families were broken, with a high percentage of these families being led by who? Black women. The Mordahan Report heavily influenced policymakers' decisions about contraceptives for Black women in the 1960s and for years to come. Black women who were economically disadvantaged and their children deemed social liabilities, and lawmakers had the power to, quote, control women's fertilities as the first step in moral and behavioral rehabilitation to ensure that poor women did not reproduce, end quote. So they took it upon themselves to not provide support, but to create harder laws and policies and create birth control so that poor women, quote, poor women did not reproduce. Theoretically, to reduce the number of unstable families, it was necessary to create a formalized control tactic to better manage Black women's reproduction to ensure the decline of unstable families. Although not identical, this modern form of control and management resonates with that of a slave master's managing and making decisions for enslaved children. While the management of reproduction for poor women of color began during slavery, universal acceptance of the report increased forms of control that were not as aggressive. In her book, Black Sexual Politics, African Americans, Gender, and the New Racism, Collins draws the connection to the controlling of enslaved women's wombs and modern day strategies of control. Collins states that under chattel slavery, the bodies of the enslaved and all that was contained in those bodies, labor, sexuality, reproduction, etc., were objectified and turned into commodities. Owners of the enslaved defined slave women as commodities, quote, eliminating their bodies, eliminating their feeling to their and rights to choose. Their head and heart were separated from their hands, and they were divided into womb and vagina, end quote. With this kind of historical background, traces of objectification of Black women's bodies remain and produce how Black women are viewed today. Control of their right to reproduction is dismissed and substituted with policies created by the dominant. Again, we see these reoccurring themes. These themes are overlap over the years. The overturn of Roe versus Wade, the landmark piece of legislation that made access to an abortion a federal right in the United States in 2022, is one example of how policies affect women's rights to make decisions about reproduction. 2 years after the release of the report, the Moynihan Report, amendments were made to the Social Security Act, raising eligibility standards and reducing welfare benefits to low-income mothers and their children. Now, but think about that. The New Deal, the Social Security Act came out in 1935. The Moynihan Report was written in 1965. It wasn't until 1967 that Black women are now becoming eligible to receive these benefits. So even still, there's a 30-year gap between when folks got assistance in these programs. Black women receiving government assistance from all over the country were active with the National Welfare Rights Organization, which angered because they were angered by these amendments that acted as a form of social control. On Mother's Day in 1968, more than 5,000 Black women marched in Washington, D.C. for the opening of the Poor People's Campaign, coordinated by the National Welfare Rights Organization, to call for a repeal of the amendments in the 1967 Social Security Act. The idea of motherhood played a vital role in welfare reform. Quote, discordant views about welfare mothers and especially Black families lay at the heart of the welfare reform efforts that both recipient activists and welfare authorities undertook. District welfare authorities and federal officials branded these recipients as immoral for their illegitimately rates and presumed their dishonesty in claiming eligibility to receive public funds, end quote. Black mothers receiving assistance had a different view of motherhood and their behaviors. Welfare rights activists, quote, refused to internalize negative perceptions, end quote, as they addressed issues that raised this image of them as immoral. Coining the slogan, Mother Power, for the 1968 march, I love that slogan, Mother Power. If you're a mom, you know. Black welfare rights activists conceived motherhood as a source of moral authority and a way to emphasize that their motivations for their family's best interests. These actions of persistence, activism, and resistance about rights tied to the family care and reproduction continued well into the 20th century. In the 1970s, and well until the decades to follow, the National Welfare Rights Organization, along with the Combahee River Collective and the National Black Feminist Organization, made reproductive rights central to their political demands, and still to this day. These organizations linked a woman's rights to prevent reproduction using abortion and birth control to the socio-economic context that chose to have a child a reality. The Black woman's rights to medical health care for herself and her children expanded to her right to be safeguarded against sterilization and attaining the means to prevent the birth of an unwanted child, and the economic means and protection for reproductive abuses necessary to bear a wanted child. Black feminist organizations supported birth control and abortion and called out sterilization abuse and disproportionately victims of sterilization abuse. These impacts of sterilization will continue to be explored in a later chapter. We're not talking about that now, but that gives you some. Now let's get into the 21st century. Now in the 21st century, Black women receiving government assistance must still deal with the negative impacts of race. In 2016, researchers from Utrecht and Colgate University studied the link between typical welfare recipients and racial stereotypes. Participants looked at 400 pairs of faces and selected the face in each pair that looked more like a welfare recipient. You can probably already imagine how this is going to go. Based on the participants' responses, the researchers superimposed images to create one photo showing the average welfare recipient and another photo showcasing the average non-recipient. The image of the average welfare recipient appeared as a Black woman, and the average of the non-recipient appeared as a white man. It is important to note the way politicians and media, particularly during the Reagan administration in the 1980s, in relation to the welfare queen, intentionally chose Black women as the face of welfare. Researchers, because again, if you look at the data, white women are actually the top recipient of government assistance. They had to be, because in 1935, Black women couldn't even get assistance. You see the irony there? Social Security Act, Black women couldn't even get assistance when it first came out. But then, because of propaganda and because of power and because of media, in the 1980s, Black women became the face of welfare. We only got access to it 20 years ago, and now we're the face of it. Researchers then asked two completely distinct groups of participants to evaluate various features, for example, race and gender. Other features related to aspects of the individual's personality, including laziness, competence, humanness, and agency, were also evaluated. Importantly, the participants were making these evaluations based on an image alone. They were not informed how these images were generated. So again, they put all of these things into these two pictures and then sent these two pictures to a group. They were not informed how these images were generated or what they represented, only that these were images of actual people who applied for government welfare programs. Additionally, participants rated the average welfare recipient as less attractive and less happy than the person who was a non-welfare recipient. Moreover, they insisted the individual representing the welfare recipient to be lazier, more incompetent, more hostile, and get this is the research, y'all, the data, less human. And if you have thoughts and feelings or questions, please feel free to use the chat as I read. I'm looking at the chats. Participants also rated the perceived average welfare recipient as generally less responsible, and specifically less responsible with food stamps and cash assistance. It is important to note that the public's idea of who is a welfare recipient is a constitution produced by systems of power. So these ratings from these participants are influenced by what messages, images, and knowledge they have received over time about who receives welfare. Racial impacts after George Floyd. The racial references presented above highlight just a handful of instances throughout history where Black women receiving government assistance have been negatively impacted by ways that racism, sexism, and classism, but also the ways in which Black women have resisted oppressive logics, and refused to take on these projections dominant culture placed on them. So we saw the impacts, but we also saw through these clubs and these organizations that these women are not accepting this. They are fighting back about how they are seen. While the murder of George Floyd did not create new experiences for Black women, it did bring about a collective national consciousness of the realities of stress from racial disparities. All the interviewees spoke about racial injustices post George Floyd and their direct impacts on thoughts about their bodies, reproduction, and motherhood. Hudson, an attorney and member of the Black Lives Matter movement, gives more insight into the ways these mothers may have processed the impact of the death of George Floyd. She says, quote, "Months before giving birth to my son, I wept for Black mothers, women like myself, who would bring handsome and talented and lively Black boys into the world that hates them so much. The killing of George Floyd is a tragic and tangible depiction of the egregious reality. And while Floyd was down on the ground advocating for himself, expressing his unbearable pain in his final moments of life. This 46-year-old Black man cried out for his mother, who, though she undoubtedly did the best that she could not protect him or save him from a broken system. Fear is a mental home base for Black mothers, end quote. Hudson speaks to this brutal reality, and even expands on the trauma by stating that the only way to protect sons from this vicious cycle is to, quote, help him not exist at all, to never birth him in the first place, end quote. Y'all, that is heartbreaking that some women don't even want to have kids because they understand that these systems do so wrong. Over half of the participants who were mothers in my study were mothers to Black boys. And they describe this fear that they have each time that their son walks out of the house. Lena is over 45 and she lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. She described this fear. She said, quote, I be scared for my kids because of this racial stuff, because police acting the way they acting. I can say that every cop is not the same, but it just seems like nobody cares, end quote. The lack of care and empathy from the police officers that Lena spoke to jolted her to act, and she practiced self-advocacy, understanding that if she did not speak up about her rights, things may never happen. So she decided to use her voice. This is how she resisted. She said, quote, when things are wrong, I always want to say something. We have rights. Yes, I will say you are wrong, end quote. For Lena, the police were making it noticeably clear through their killings that they do not care about Black lives. To protect this stance, proclaiming that Black lives do matter and standing up for wrongdoings, Lena used her voice to dissent against injustice. Other women in the study who were mothers to Black boys spoke to how nervous they became because of their son's protection. Ebony, who's 35, also in North Carolina, shared this, quote, first of all, I have 2 Black sons from the hood, basically, and I don't know. I'd be more nervous for them to play outside because they could run out and the police could pull up and things get hot and my sons get shot. So it just makes me nervous, end quote. Geraldine, over 45 in North Carolina, spoke to an in-depth conversation she had to have with her sons to ensure they had a chance to make it home if they were ever confronted by the police. She says this, quote, I have 2 sons, African-American sons. So the murder of George Floyd does not concern me the murder of George Floyd does concern me because the police are out here daily, and my son's actions can be misconstrued. You can be doing something innocent and you just don't know what could happen. It could be my son that gets, God knows I don't want that to happen, but it could also happen because there's so much going on with the police and African-American males. You tell your sons every day, be careful, watch your back. If the police pulls you over, if you are speeding or not, you make sure your hands are seen. You don't move, you follow directions so you can come home and tell the story. Do not try to argue. Do not try to say that you weren't speeding. Just listen. And if you get an opportunity before the police get to your door, when you are in your vehicle, make sure your phone records so they can have that so you can have that voice, end quote. When asked if recording police interactions was advice she started giving after the murder of George Floyd, Geraldine responded with this, quote, yes, I always tell them now to record because of the simple fact that sometimes Not to say that all police officers are racist, but recording is your protection. It always is for your protection. And you'll have a witness if nobody else is around. Cell phones, technology right now could be your best friend or your worst enemy. And in that circumstance, I will always tell them that it is your best friend. End quote. At the end of the day, Ebony and Geraldine simply want their Black sons to live. The thought of them dying at the hands of the police required them to be even more cautious. The innocence of their children is not able to be preserved because, as mothers, watching police brutality reoccurring to protect their sons, they must teach them at an early age how to survive. The summer of racial reckoning from 2020 to 2022 also impacted Black women who were not mothers. 2 out of 11 participants who I talked to were not mothers, and they still spoke about the terror that they witnessed due to the murder of George Floyd. Woman number 7, who was between 36 and 44 years old in California, she reflected on how she was more aware of her responses to white police officers. She said, quote, "I was walking the other day in my cousin's neighborhood, and I stopped to get out on a prayer call. I was praying, and there was a white police officer sitting in the car. I was scared to even pray because I was like, what if I'm praying too loud? What if he says I'm disturbing the peace? Luckily, after I was done praying, he said, I actually needed to hear that. That calmed me down for a second, but at the end of the day, he's still a white police officer, and he'll still assimilate. And if it comes down to protecting himself for me, he's going to protect himself," end quote. The fear of seeing a white police officer is so consuming that even if a woman has not done anything wrong, she is still afraid to engage in her daily practices. Seeing a white police officer triggered woman number 7 to think about the volume of her prayers as a potential cause for altercation. And although in this particular case, the police officer positively responded to woman number 7, the fear is still there. The fear remains because next time she may not be so lucky. The idea of whiteness protecting itself is something that comes up repeatedly through these interviews, revealing a practice that perpetuates racism and continues to uphold whiteness as superior. Robin DiAngelo expounds on this idea, explaining how, quote, white people in North America live in a social environment that protects and assimilates them from race-based stress, end quote. Fine in 1997 identifies this assimilation when she observes, quote, how whiteness secures power and privilege and status. It gets surrounded by these protective pillows of resources and benefits of the doubt. How whiteness repels gossip and instead demands dignity, end quote. White people are rarely without these protective pillows, and when they are, it is usually temporary or by choice. This insulated environment of racial privilege builds white expectations of racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress. These protective pillows that Robin DiAngelo is speaking to, they exist outside of Black women's identities. Black women are not granted these protective pillows. They're not granted these protective pillows. And that's very important to understand. Black women have constantly been the target of violence, expulsion, and erasure. And the women in this study experience these impacts of racial oppression constantly. And yet, they still find ways to actively engage in practices of resistance to fight for their justice. That's the end of the chapter of racial reckoning. That chapter is so powerful for me because it lets us know a couple of things. One, What happened to George Floyd 5 years ago is not a new story. That's why I had to talk about Reconstruction. That's why I had to talk about sterilization and reproductive rights. That's why I had to talk about welfare reform in the 1960s. That's why I had to talk about the studies even happening in the 21st century, where people are calling folks less human over a picture because it's a Black woman who's a welfare recipient. I have to. This chapter is unlike any other because it talks about the very long history of racial oppression for Black people. And specifically, clearly, my research focuses on Black women, but let this also be a timeline over the ways in which racism has been produced for everyone. Racism is an institution that's so large that everyone is impacted. No matter, we're just fish in the lake. The lake is toxic and we are all fish in the toxic lake. And that's how we have to think about racism. But also, you saw and heard that even in the 1890s, even in the 1930s, even in the 1960s, and still to this day, women are resisting. Women are saying, no, honey, that doesn't apply to me. We're out here. We are stable. We are educated. We will not tolerate this. So I just want to wrap up with a couple of stories in my community support section. Community support is one of the everyday resistance strategies that came out of this research. Faith was one, sacrifice was another, and centering self was the three others. But I just want to just read a small snippet from the community support chapter, because I think that even in these times, especially in these times, we really need our community. We really need people that are for us and to be around. So I'm just going to read a short snippet from the community support section. Existing culture requires constant negotiation because, as Hall puts it, popular culture is the arena of consent and resistance. These women experience the tension between consent and resistance every day. Their ability to survive persistent social economic quorums depends on community support. The responses to these questions, who and what supports you through all of this, who and what empowers you to keep going, resulted in the most popular strategy. Community support was the most popular strategy. Literally, 100% of the women spoke to a wide range of people in their lives who empowered them, encouraged them, motivated them to keep going. So here are just a couple of them. Mel is in Texas. Mel is between 25 and 35. This is what she says, quote, "Both of my sisters play different roles for my son, which I am very thankful for. One sister is the financial girl. She's going to teach him numbers. She gives him puzzles and things with numbers and letters. And the older sister, she's like the mom. She's always checking on him and making sure that he's okay." End quote. This is so important, especially when we think about George Floyd, because during the media coverage of the murder of George Floyd, one of the other participants, Nefertiti, she was scared. She felt defeated and hopeless, knowing that this tragic experience and the effects of it impacted her relatives. So she turned to communication and emotional release to get through these dark times. Understanding how difficult it was for a Black woman to be emotional and vulnerable with others without being stereotyped or criticized. But she knew she could turn to her family. She said this, quote, "We have a cousin chat that we use all the time. We also use FaceTime in order to see everyone in the same place all together. When George Floyd got murdered, we all just cried together. We just cried together on the phone. We just sat there and we just cried, asking each other, did you see that? We also talked about it. It's so emotional because Though they may not have sons, they have brothers. I got male cousins. It's just so much to take in. That helps me though, because I can't cry in front of everybody. I can't cry in front of people. I can't cry at work. Because the world does not accept my tears as sadness, but they see it as weakness. End quote. So I love that Nefertiti, while the murder of George Floyd was happening, she could turn to her cousin group chat. She was like, we all on FaceTime and we just gonna cry. We just gonna release. I love that so much. Ebony had a core of friends who helped her get through tough times. She said, quote, I have friends to get me through the struggle. The bond of sisterhood gave her an outlet when things felt heavy. For Ebony, her friends were who she vented to, so she could also vent, hang out, babysit, whatever she needed. Her core friends were her go-to for community support. Shantae is out of Alabama, and also woman number 7. They talked about people who were not in their family. Shantae chose her therapist. She said, my therapist became my holistic person. She said, quote, I do see a therapist and we work together on my holistic well-being. Having a therapist who cares about my interests and my goals and my physical health provides me with the level of freedom where I can be my true self, end quote. Woman number 7 out of California, she became physically stronger because of her community support. Food had constantly been a struggle for her. And so she became physically and emotionally exhausted, especially during the pandemic and even more when George Floyd was murdered. She said, I knew that I needed to get back on my food journey and release this dead weight. My pastor's wife was my community support. She's a food coach, a dietitian, and she taught me about conscious eating and how to create healthy boundaries, end quote. Community support, or community care, as it is referred to in Black feminist theory, providing capacity and bandwidth to each other in order to make it through oppression. These women were clear that their community stepped in when they did not have the capacity to do so on their own. I'll end with this. Community care allows Black women to share the load. Audre Lorde says that self-care cannot exist without community. It is something that these women who interviewed, who I talked to, knew to be so true. Community support is significant to the daily lives of these women because together they are stronger. Together, we are stronger, y'all. Racism, sexism, capitalism, all of these systems of power and oppression are at play at the same time. And although we are talking about the murder of George Floyd, we talked about the murder of George Floyd today. It is imperative to name that his life mattered. His life still matters. It is important to name that he did not deserve any of these things that happened to him 5 years ago. Black people, Black women, people on the margins, people in vulnerable communities, they do not deserve violence. They do not deserve brutality. They do not deserve injustice. They deserve basic rights. They deserve love. They deserve access. And so 5 years later, I am just here to name and say George Floyd's name. I am here to say Breonna Taylor's name. I am here to say Ahmaud Arbery's name. I am here to say Trayvon Martin's name. I am here to say Sandra Bland's name. I am here to say Mike Brown's name. I am here to say Fidel Castile's name. I am here to say their names, and I will continue to say their names. But I also want us to recognize the power that we currently have to resist against these systems of power and oppression. So I leave you with this question. How are you going to resist? What are the ways and the practices that you may already be doing? Community support, them you may already be doing that. Faith, praying, you may already be doing that. Centering yourself and being like, I'm gonna take care of me first. You could already be doing that. Choosing joy, you could already be doing that. Those are acts of resistance. So put your resistance strategies in the chat. Proclaim how you are going to continue to fight for the freedom that you deserve. I hope that this research and this information was helpful for you. I also want to just applaud and continue to thank the women who I talk to who live this every day and show their power every day. Please make sure that you follow. Please make sure that you subscribe. Please make sure that you connect, and please make sure that you fight for the justice that you deserve. Y'all have a good day. Thanks for joining. George Floyd, we love you. Peace.